Hey, 42 here. We think of wars as relatively uncommon, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Since the end of the Second World War, there have been over 250 major wars worldwide. That equates to almost 4 wars per year. But war isn't a new problem invented by the stresses and tensions of modern day life. Over the past 3,400 years, humans have only been at peace entirely without war for 268 of them. To put that into perspective, humans have only been at peace with one another for 8% of recorded history. All this fighting doesn't come without a heavy price tag. Wars are ridiculously costly, both in cold hard cash and human lives. But what is that price tag? Let's find out the real cost of a war once and for all. First, let's try and work out the cost of war's ugliest side effect: human lives. Every war has a different cost. So for the purpose of illustration, let's examine a recent, well-documented war, the Iraq and Afghanistan War on Terror. A long, large-scale and horrendously expensive war that began in 2001 following the 9/11 attacks, which to some extent still goes on to this day. The number of estimated deaths of the Iraq-Afghanistan war between 2001 and 2014 are as follows. US and Allied troops 38,733, journalists 344, humanitarian workers 438, opposition forces 88,024, and finally civilians 220,000. Yep, that's right. In most wars, the majority of casualties are not from the armies themselves, but civilians. And those numbers are only the deaths caused directly by conflict. They don't include the thousands of other indirect deaths caused by the side effects of war, such as disease and famine. The majority of civilian casualties during the Iraq-Afghanistan war were caused by anti-personnel and anti-tank mines, as well as ground attacks from insurgents. There's no denying that the human cost of war is immeasurably horrific. So let's take a look at the second facet of wartime expense: the monetary cost. How much money do you really need to go to war with another country? Again, the answer entirely depends on the scale and the nature of the war. So let's once again use the Iraq-Afghanistan war as an example. Why? Because it was the most expensive war of the past 50 years. It is estimated that by the time it's over, the Iraq-Afghanistan war will cost a whopping $6 trillion US. To put that into perspective, $6 trillion is enough money to feed every single starving person on Earth for 200 years. Just to clarify, with that money you could feed 1 billion starving people every year for the next 200 years. But it's not quite as simple as just sending all that money to Africa. The majority of the money the US used to pay for the war was actually borrowed, mostly from China. The George Bush administration estimated it would cost between $50 and $60 billion to invade Iraq and overthrow Saddam Hussein. That's considerably less than the total running cost as of today. So what went wrong? What were all those $6 trillion of taxpayers and borrowed money spent on? Well, the thing is, they haven't actually been spent yet. To date, the US has spent $1.6 trillion towards the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. That includes everything from military equipment, firearms, training, wages, and hiring third-party contractors, among others. It's estimated that the cost of keeping a single American soldier in Iraq or Afghanistan for a year is $3.9 million. So where does the other estimated $4.4 trillion come in? Well, that comes later. The biggest cost of a war is not the war itself, it's the aftermath. Especially when you borrow most of the money you use to pay for the war. The majority of the money used to pay for the Iraq-Afghanistan war was borrowed, and there's a big load of interest to pay on top of it. The interest is so great, in fact, that over the next few years the repayments will tally up to several trillions of dollars. But there's an even bigger long-term cost. veteran care and benefits. 970,000 veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars have registered for disability claims. Over the course of the next 50 years, payments for the care and welfare of all those veterans will bring the total cost of the war up to an estimated $6 trillion. But for every soldier who fights in the war, sadly for them, the war never ends. In 2012, more veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars committed suicide than were actually killed in action. This isn't a new problem. Most veterans of the 1982 Falklands War have committed suicide since the war than died in combat. War has many evil facets, and whether it's a medieval battle or a modern-day high-tech skirmish, you can always count on two things. The effects will be catastrophic, and the costs will be outrageously high. But wars don't have to be expensive. In 1920, the British forces defeated the Dervish forces of Muhammad Abdullah Hassan, who was more commonly referred to as Mad Mullah amongst opposition forces. Britain's resistance against the 20-year-old Dervish forces was known as the Somaliland Campaign. It came to a climax during the fifth and final war of the campaign in 1920, when the British Royal Air Force, accompanied by Britain's Somaliland Camel Corps, yes, that was actually a thing, defeated the Dervishes' stronghold in what was then known as British Somaliland. This war has gone down in history as the cheapest war in history, costing a grand total of just £77,000, which is about £3.5 million by today's standards. That sounds expensive, but it's actually really bloody cheap. Most wars cost in the region of several billions to several trillion. If most wars are so expensive and cause nothing but turmoil and sorrow, then why do we have them in the first place? It's widely debated that wars don't actually solve any problems. After all, we have only been without war for 8% of recorded history. If wars solved problems, wouldn't that mean war would become less frequent? When in reality, the opposite is happening. With 250 wars in the past 70 years, it seems that wars only create more problems, and subsequently more wars. Many people believe wars are strictly for profit. Yes, wars are costly, but they also put money into many pockets, namely arms and military vehicle manufacturers. When the cost is human lives, it's saddening to think that some people are profiting from it. It truly is a sickening thought. But whether profit is actually the main contributing factor to starting a war is still a topic of much debate and controversy. Every war is different. Sometimes it's driven by profit, and other times it's just the perverted fantasies and disillusions of a doomed soul. Thanks for the view. Subscribe for more 42.
As a combat veteran, I know the cost of war. Tulsi Gabbard. Here are the 25 most expensive wars in history. 25. War on Terror. Including the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, this fight has cost the nations involved a significant amount.